This episode was co-produced by Deep Tech Nation Switzerland Foundation, a non-profit foundation committed to sustainably improving the framework for Swiss startups, scale-ups, and investors in the deep tech sector. Their goals are to mobilize 50 billion Swiss francs in venture capital and create 100,000 jobs within the next 10 years, making Switzerland the world-leading deep tech nation. Check out how they can support your business journey at deeptechnation.ch. Again, that's deeptechnation.ch.
Young entrepreneurs, they like the awards because it's shiny, they're on the stage. But I always tell them, one award is enough, and then all the next awards are your clients. If they order something, this is an award.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. If you enjoy listening to our show, make sure to follow the podcast and leave a rating. And now, here's your host, Silvan.
Roland, a very well welcome back to the Swisspreneur Show. It's great to have you as a guest again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You are a professor for autonomous systems at the ETH here in Zurich, but you're also a board member at multiple startups, sort of like a bit of a godfather of ETH spin-offs, I would say. Before we dive in there, it has been 3 years since you were last on the Swisspreneur Show, so I just wonder, how have you been? What has happened in 3 years' time?
So officially I would be retired since a year. So this is happening, but I will continue for another 3.5 years. But a little bit more focusing on our startups. We have a lot of interesting and promising startups, and I want to follow up with them a little bit more closely in the next years to come.
So it's a bit of a shift from teaching more towards working with startups. Is that accurate?
Yes, I will not teach any more classes next year, but I will be still involved in student projects, and we have this focus project with some of these projects actually were then at the end ending up as startups. And so we'll continue with these type of collaboration with students.
That's amazing. And then eventually retirement, is that planned or not on the horizon yet?
Officially from ETH, there is a retirement
right.
In 3.5 years, but hopefully I can still do and be useful for some of the startups and some other stuff.
We're glad that you're not leaving the ecosystem yet. ETH is always up there with the world's top universities, right? What do you think is the secret sauce of this very special place here in Switzerland? What keeps you showing up there very high in these international rankings?
Of course, I think there is a couple of key elements. Probably the first and the most important thing is really the talents. Talents on the professor's level and the senior scientist level, but mainly also on the student level. So you have to be able to attract the best students, and then you're getting better anyway. This is probably the most important element. But of course, you need also a good basic funding. And this, up to now, we have it in Switzerland. I think we are very grateful about this, which allows us really to go for new things and not always for each little cent run for money, but really start things and which will then further develop and get extra funding.
And talking about talent, this is the most important ingredient for success, you said. There's a lot of geopolitical uncertainties these days, right? With the US, but also with European funding. Sometimes it's a bit of back and forth. How do you still make sure that you have good talent inflow despite all the challenges that are out there in the world?
Of course, you could mainly say probably that we have now even a better inflow because there are a lot of uncertainties in US. Mm-hmm. But of course, this is not what we want. We want to keep in touch with them. We want to keep and interact with US and so on. But at the moment, it's not hurting us a lot. In some situations, we had really outstanding talents on different levels, which we're actually now considering to come back to Switzerland because it's more uncertain in US.
That is quite crazy, right? I think there was a media article this week that actually said that now even the top tier professors from Harvard, etc., are considering coming to Switzerland. So it's actually maybe even a benefit for you here in Zurich?
I think the top universities, they will also, in US, they also rely on the same thing, the best talents, mainly students, PhD students, but also a good funding base. And both is now a little bit in question in US. The funding has been cut in some universities drastically. And of course, the inflow of students from abroad is also more and more in question in US. And so they are really struggling.
So it's a good time to invest in Switzerland even more than before. Let's also talk about other success factors. Of course, talent is really important, but it alone is not enough. You mentioned funding is another important sort of ingredient. What else do you do there? How do you attract the right funding, and what other ingredients contribute to ETH success?
I think in the end is also the autonomy we have and we still have at ETH. Sometimes a little bit getting a little bit more difficult. There is more and more control in most universities, but also in companies. But this is important that you really can generate new things. You can really act very fast. And then you can actually generate also some sort of an ecosystem, which is really driven by research, but also driven probably by bringing this research to its applications. Again, there is at the end about role models. So once you had the first two startups, there will be much more coming on because people are attracted by doing something themselves and they see where this can happen, and then they come, and we have sometimes students coming from abroad, and then I ask them, why did you come to ETH? And they say, because you have the best environment, I want to start a startup later on.
Wow, that's an amazing sort of feedback to get. And you yourself, Richie, once said, I'm not sure if that's fully true, but I read that you wanted to become an entrepreneur yourself. You then turned professor. Of course, you work with many startups, etc. But do you ever regret of not having pursued the entrepreneurial route yourself earlier on?
Indeed, I wanted to become an entrepreneur. I've never thought that I will stay forever, more or less, at universities. I was actually, after my PhD, also involved in a startup, in the first one, which I was really working in. But I will never regret. I think probably the beauty about being a professor, you can be also an entrepreneur for doing research, but also then bring this to the market. And you have a lot of young people around you. I think this is probably the best job you can have.
I love that. And tell us a bit more, how do you sort of shape the startups coming out of ETH? How do you breed them and also make that translation from research into a commercial application? Because that sounds easy, but it's very, very difficult to do in practice, I imagine.
Yes, it's not so easy because very often at the starting point for our starters is research, open research. You have always dreams for whatever, and once you become a startup, you have to really go for the products which have a market today and not tomorrow. Yeah. And you have to really stop dreaming and probably dreaming about the market, but not dreaming about the next generation of a very fancy robot. And how we do this in most startups where I'm somewhat involved, I'm always trying to find senior people which have had an entrepreneurial career, either as a startup themselves, but very often it's also people which were CEO of leading companies, which have now time, and they can help these young people to really focus on the strategy to really come on the market. And I think this is the best thing for all sides, because these more elderly people, typically they are extremely exciting to join in with a team of young people and help them really to become successful.
So it is sort of a recipe for success with three ingredients there. You have the young entrepreneurs, you have research coming out of ETH, and you have senior people with experience and probably a network all together joining forces.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important to have the senior people also in, because they can add a lot of value. And happily, I have a very strong network in Zurich, so I always find a person who is interested. And some people actually join even multiple of the startups as chairman of the board, and typically they are also partially executive for a while.
That's amazing. And how do you decide which research that you actually want to spin off in a company? Are there any certain signals that you look for, or like early customers or customer interest when you talk and conduct the research? How does that exactly work?
In principle, I think we are doing engineering research, and this has always a link with potential applications. So I think this is automatically given with most of the research we are doing. We're trying to solve problems which would allow technology to further evolve. And the key element at the end is the team. It's students, PhD students mainly, but sometimes it's also master students, which are really eager to move forward and bring their ideas towards the market. In some fields, we probably had never a team which wanted to push this forward. For example, solar airplanes, small drones, which can fly forever. I was always dreaming to have a startup, but there was never a team, and so we didn't do it.
So it is really driven by the team, not necessarily that you have a great research finding and then you are looking for a team. It has to be driven sort of bottom up by the team.
Yes, I think it's very often people say that team is first and the idea is second and the technology behind. And I would agree. We have seen examples where the technology was wonderful, but the team was not able to bring this off the ground and it failed.
Yeah, good point. Good sort of reminder for all of us to reflect on that. Then how do you get involved with startups? I know you said, okay, now next year you will stop the teaching part, so you have even a bit more time maybe, but how do you get involved with startups? Do you become an investor? Do you become a board member? What is your go-to strategy to be involved there?
So we have a lot of startups which came out of my lab. In some, I'm really involved myself. In most of them, I was involved as a professor at ETH, because this is also one of our tasks to try to bring our technology to the market. But then in some of the others, it's probably a good handful where I'm more involved. I have some shares. Then typically also I'm doing some investment in the early phase, and now I'm in the board of 3 startup companies.
Amazing. And I guess that's sort of the best way to then also close the loop again from research to commercialization.
Yes, of course. I will learn with all our startups also how we can do it better for the next startup. Yeah. And so I think being close to the startups helps a lot also even for the education side.
Absolutely. And when sort of a startup is being created out of research at ETH, how do you handle the whole IP topic? I know that's another very important discussion that you probably have, because the ETH invested a lot of resources also to support and fund that research. And then there's a commercial potential, but also still a very big risk. How do you sort of have these discussions about who owns the IP and who gets sort of what piece of the cake?
Of course, ETH is in principle very open to really give the IP to the startups with a certain chance of return. Mm-hmm. So it might be royalties, but it's mainly equity. So that they have a couple of % of the company, and hopefully in long term, this will give a return for the next generation of startups. And I think sometimes it's probably a bit difficult to do all these term sheet discussions because there's a lot of different aspects. For example, if a student has a part of the idea, they own by the student. Everything which is done by PhD students, which are on the payroll of ETH, this is owned by ETH. But then we have to sort all these out, the different elements which come together. Sometimes it's getting a little bit complex, but we are trying now to really have much more and simpler, lean structure. And I always say that in principle, it's a benefit for ETH anyway, because if you create new, really well-paid, good jobs, they will return actually taxes. And ETH is mainly living from taxes. So in principle, it's the return from startups should be something but it should not be in long term the main source of funding for ETH. It's an add-on, but the main source of funding for the ETH is from the government, and they benefit from our startups.
I like that perspective because it's also a long-term game, so to speak. And you keep the flexibility within the startup to make business decisions in that sense. Talking about funding, why, I'm not sure, like you invest privately as a individual. Does ETH sometimes also invest beyond IP part, but actually put money down in exchange for shares? Or is that something that is not done yet?
No, this is not done by ETH. And I think it's also correct like this. But there is actually a little bit of investment by the ETH Foundation, which is an independent foundation, which is doing the fundraising for different big projects with research. And they have typically some funds anyway, because it's long term. So imagine that you have for 10 years, 20 million, then you have to invest this.
Yeah.
And so they started to invest some of this money into our own startups. But this is a small element.
And I mean, with all the brand that you build and the high quality reputation, it's probably fairly easy for ETH spin-offs to go out there and raise money from traditional investors.
Yeah, I think it's pretty okay. It was getting a little bit more difficult in the last years, I think, starting with COVID. And then there is always also this element that some fields are all of a sudden hype. There's a lot of money flowing in this, and other elements of startups which are more in a traditional way of businesses, all of a sudden have more problem to get funding. But I think up to now we have, for the early phase, we have good ways in Switzerland to get funding. What we are still struggling is actually for the long term, for the scaling up for companies. But there is now this Deep Tech Nation Switzerland Foundation, which hopefully can make an impact that we have more funding for scaling.
100%. That's much needed, because otherwise you have foreign investors sweeping in. And then this tax money that you mentioned that is so important for the returns on society, so to speak, is happening abroad.
Yeah, so I think it's natural that if the main investor is coming from US or even from France, there is a risk and a tendency that all of a sudden the headquarters of the company and the main collaborators will end up in another country. Yeah. We have a couple of these examples, and I hope that we have in the future more startups which can really scale, but mainly in Switzerland. Of course, you will automatically, with deep tech, you will be international, but the headquarters and the main brains should be in Switzerland.
Absolutely, especially because there was such a big investment in research, in their education of the founders, etc. You said there's more money needed for the growth phase. I know that there are discussions about having pension funds involved there. Would that be a suitable solution, or how can we fix that to have more funds available for the growth stage?
Of course, pension funds is a vehicle which has a lot of money and long-term money. And I think they should invest more in startups, because startups takes a long time, especially deep tech like robotics. You cannot expect to get break even before 10 or 15 years. No. So you need a lot of money in the beginning. But pension funds have these funds. I, on the other side, think also that if you do it wisely, it really can give a very good return. Yep. But pension fund already today can do this, and some do it. Hopefully, we can convince more pension fund to spend some money for startups, because there's so much money around. So even if they put 2, 3, 4% into startup ecosystem, this will already make a huge difference. Yeah.
And I mean, they can focus on exactly that growth stage to also have a lower risk compared to the early days, right? Where else could the money come from? Pension funds could be one part. And you said there is money in Switzerland, not only in pension funds. So how else could we get the growth stages funded for the Swiss startups?
Yes, of course, it's Switzerland. There's a lot of people which have a lot of money. So, and there is, of course, also foreign money which is managed in Switzerland. So, I think it's not an issue of not having the money around, but it's more the question who is willing to go for this probably higher risk phase. I personally think the risk is not higher, but of course, it's difficult to convince. And I think this has also to do in US. The funding of startups is quite different. They pour a lot of money at these startups, and then they say either successful or die. Yep. We have a lot of startups from ETH which don't exponentially grow, but they steadily grow, and they will make it, but it will take time. And there the risk is not so high, as long as you have a good people, a good technology, and an interesting market. And there is also some studies which show that typically ETH deep tech startups have a very high success rate. We have not so many which scale up to unicorns, but it's also not so important to have only unicorns. Switzerland is living from a lot of small, medium-sized companies which do a wonderful, which are internationally leading, but are not unicorns.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in that sense, you also have a very strong alumni network, right, of ETH students or former students. Could that also be a market to tap into to get the startups funded for the growth round?
Yes, and I think this is already the case. There's a lot of former students of ETH which are then coming back to in some or the other way. They're also the ETH foundations helping a lot because they're in contact with those people which might be not only there for donating something for research, but also helping probably startups and the ecosystem. And one example is the Pioneer Fellowship at ETH, which I introduced during my time as vice president. And there the money is not coming from ETH and not from government. The money is coming from donations from people which typically studied before at ETH and are really happy with what ETH is doing.
That's amazing. Soon there might even be an ETH fund, whoever runs it, but to really invest in ETH spin-offs, basically.
Yeah, this is a discussion since a very long time.
I imagine.
I think we have to be careful there because we are still a governmental institution in principle, and we cannot probably be as freely in doing our own funds like a private university in US.
Of course.
But on the other side, we have a lot of instruments to interact with existing funds to attract people to invest in our startups, and I think we can even do more in the future.
Absolutely. I also remember there was the Deep Tech Investor Summit earlier this year taking place at ETH. And of course, as it is in the media right now, everyone was talking about AI. And then there was the second day, there were actually startup pitches happening. And I remember that really the robotics startup, they sort of stole the show because they were showing so much advanced technology and so much traction compared to everyone else that it was really like, hey, this is the real stuff happening here at ETH. It's the robotics startup. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think I'm also extremely excited about robotics because it's not only software or AI, but it's also hardware.
Yeah.
But it's much more difficult. So it takes much longer to bring something to the market. But on the other side, if once you're on the market, you have probably so many USPs because you're also building on hardware, which is not so easy to copy, that you really have a very good situation on the market. But it takes long.
Yeah, that's sort of the trade-off, right? It's also way harder to then compete with you once you are at the certain stage. I also want to talk about the startups per se. You once said, if you want to build a perfect product, you will never be on the market. And I think that's very accurate. How do you balance the academic rigor of doing everything perfect and the right way with the moving fast startup mentality? That, I imagine, is sometimes not an easy balance to strike for.
Yes, that's indeed very difficult, especially because the people typically which are coming out of research from ETH, they are always dreaming for the perfect solution and they are always thinking long term. I think the most important thing is probably the market pull. Mm-hmm. So it's in the beginning, you have to really find markets where the need is extremely strong, even if the markets are not so big. But then the market will pull you and you have to, in principle, to offer a product which is not perfect, but which will do the job so that you can move forward. And I think the market contact and finding the right market to start and to evolve your company is extremely important.
And I'm sure you also support the startups there. You probably have a lot of partnerships with ETH. You know a lot of people yourself through your personal network. How do you make these connections happen? Because that's probably the make it or break it moment. If you can get in front of the right customers at the right time with your technology.
Yes, I think startups from ETH or in general from university or research institution which have themselves a strong visibility have an advantage that there will be automatically people all of a sudden coming into the system. Yeah. So what I do extremely often, so I have requests from companies for something which we cannot do as a researcher. We are not building products, but I can link them with the startups and then they can hopefully develop something together.
A nice win-win situation in that sense. Hey, did you know that Swisspreneur just published a book? That's right. We've spent the past year writing Swiss Startups, a compact view of some of the most amazing startup journeys in Switzerland, from scrappy beginnings to world domination. If you love listening to our podcast, then this is about to become your new favorite book. Find it now in all major bookstores or click the link in the show notes to order your copy from Helvetic today. I also want to talk about the business side because, of course, ETH is very technical, but then often the founders coming out of research, they train and learn the business skills on the job when then actually building and starting a company. On the other hand, we often hear, maybe it's a bit a romanticized idea of ETH and HSG, for example, working more closely together. Do you think this is necessary, or is it simply, no, you start with the technology and then you learn the business as you go?
No, I think it's really good. I was also pushing in different ends. We actually, from the Gebert Riff Foundation, where I'm the president of the board, is we actually initiated something which is called Talent Kick. And this is across universities. It's very early. This is people which have a dream to start a company. And we want to link them very early on. Because sometimes it's a problem if you have already a strong tech team from ETH to get somebody more with a business view into the team. It's not so easy but if you grow together, this is a perfect situation.
Yeah.
On the other side, I think engineering students, they can learn everything.
It's true.
But they should probably not, because they should actually focus on what they are extremely strong on. Right. And then they should really team up with somebody from HSG or from another university, which are really more in a different field, and they can much faster really have an impact.
I think it's easier to learn the business if you come from a technical background than the other way around. To learn the technical background if you come from a business background. This is way harder to do, I feel.
Yes, I think it's also shown, it's like in sport. Our brain is extremely good in up to probably 30, 35, and you can learn a lot of things. And we train in principle at ETH, first of all, the brain, and then the content comes with it. And so you can learn stuff which is not so complex, which is not so mathematical, also after 35. But you will not learn the basics and then really normal mathematics easily if you're getting a little bit older.
That's true.
So you have more experience if you're older, but you are less dynamic in your brain.
Fair point. I also wonder you said we have more role models now also because there were already quite a lot of great success stories coming out of ETH. So role models, we always need more, but that's on a good path. What else is missing in Switzerland from your perspective? Growth funding we talked about, but if you could change anything on a political level, on an education level, no matter where, if you could change one thing to further improve the startup ecosystem, where would you work?
We are probably a little bit too scattered still. So, of course, I would say that we have one line, which is Venture Kick, which most the university startups go through them, but we have a lot of other events and a lot of activities. And I think it would be nice to have fewer events, but then really stellar events. Yeah. Imagine these VCs from US, which are at one point probably also interesting to invest. They will not come 5 times to Switzerland. They come once. True. And you can see now we have startup days. We have the start in St. Gallen, which does also something similar. Then there is ETH themselves. So I hope we will find a way that we have one big event, which everybody will be there, and we find a way and a model that all the people can really also get exposure, can pitch the startups. It's, of course, the bigger the event, the more difficult it is.
Yeah, that's true. But I agree that we have more visibility to potential like US investors or something like that as a whole, as Switzerland as a whole ecosystem compared to having fragmented.
Yeah,
events.
in Silicon Valley, they have this where, in principle, everybody is on the same spot. Yeah. We have this partially in Switzerland, and we have to work at it becoming stronger.
Do you have an example of a good event that you really like yourself that is doing that in a good way?
I think the Y Combinator is something very interesting. I was never myself there, but I had a couple of my students being there, and they were extremely excited, where they really early on get in touch with people which invest in them, but will also support them. Oh. And we don't have something similar in the Switzerland at the moment. Hopefully we'll get this, but we cannot always compare exactly one-to-one. Silicon Valley has plenty of people which became crazy rich with the big tech companies, and they are willing to play with their money. Yeah. They still a bit less in Switzerland, but we can do still better.
We need more success stories and more money flowing back that the founders who make a successful exit can then reinvest into the ecosystem. That's the flywheel to keep it going. I also wonder, when you work with PhD students, right? They invested a lot of time and also, of course, hard work and energy into pursuing their PhD. And then at a certain point, they're probably saying, okay, now I've spent so much time at university. Now all these big corporate jobs out there, they want to lure me in and they offer me very nice salaries. Is it sometimes difficult to convince students to pursue an entrepreneurial career instead of going and working for a very well-paying corporate?
Interestingly not. And this is where I'm extremely excited about it. It's for the startups, even for getting people which are not co-founder but later in, it's not too difficult to find outstanding people. And I think it has to do that the big tech company which had 20 years ago or even 10 years ago still a little bit the groove of a startup, they don't have it anymore. Yeah. So people are there in a huge company. They actually don't know why, who is deciding what, and they also don't see the purpose anymore. Yeah. But of course, they get a lot of money out of it. But people are more and more also purpose-driven, which I think is wonderful, because at long term, at one point after studying ETH, you have enough salary, even in a startup, to have a good living. And what else do you want?
Exactly. More is not always better in that sense. The purpose is the way to go.
We have more and more also people from Google or Facebook or whatever, which come back to the startup.
Wow.
And they have a much lower salary, but then they see that they are part of the driver's seat and can really influence and have a purpose.
That is really interesting, because if you also, again, read the media, that's always this endless discussion, right? There's so much demand for good tech talent. And the big companies have a bit an unfair advantage compared to a startup because they can pay higher salaries. But it sounds that this is not that big of a problem anymore.
No, I think it's not that big of a problem. Of course, they can also give equity.
Sure.
And hopefully this will pay off in long term. Yeah. I think it's more the problem of very standard but very high quality tech company in Switzerland which are doing machines and so on. They have an issue because they cannot let people participate. They have still a certain size where there is a hierarchy in it, and they have a problem to compete with companies like Google or Facebook or Microsoft.
Fair enough. There's another thing I want to briefly talk about. You said before, we don't have that many unicorns, but we also don't really need that necessarily, because there are very solid, profitable companies emerging out of the research and the spin-offs. At the same time, we often hear that the Swiss, especially the Swiss founders, they are rock solid with their technology, but they just don't think big enough. Is that something that you think should change, or is our way really a bit different, where we say, no, we don't need to go for these unicorn valuations. We are perfectly fine building a successful and sustainable business and being profitable?
Yeah, I think there is different views on this. Of course, there is also a lot of young people which start a company and they dream about a good exit and then a nice life. And this is not the entrepreneurs we need. Yeah. We need entrepreneurs who want to really make a difference. And now in a lot of the technologies which ETH is spinning off, it takes a long time. Mm-hmm. These unicorns will come, I'm pretty sure. It's probably more the problem that we should, I think, fuse a little bit some of companies. I have some ideas how we could bring multiple startups together so that they really are big enough to go public at one point and have really a very strong impact worldwide. But this is not easy because these are all driven by entrepreneurs which have their dream themselves and they don't want to be integrated in something bigger. Yeah. But I think we should do this at one point because we need, of course, also in technology, new companies. We have companies like ABB and Sulzer, but some of them are struggling. And we need the next generation of these companies, which are extremely important for Switzerland.
Absolutely. How would that idea look like? Would you put together like a special purpose vehicle to bundle a few companies together and then bring them public?
That would be, of course, if I would have a couple hundred millions, I would immediately start to do this. Yeah. In principle, to be involved in all this company and then convince them at one point that we fuse together in a holding structure, whatever. Yeah. Because there is a couple of fields where we are really dominating the market with our startups, but they're still somewhat considerably small. But everything which is inspection of a big infrastructure and so on, we are in robotics, for example, we are extremely strong. Yeah. And we have multiple startups in these fields. They all have an overlap of probably in some fields 50% of the final customer.
Crazy.
So it would be probably an easy way to go together and to offer the customer everything. Inspection on the water, inspection in the air, and the inspection on the platform.
Yeah, and then you probably also have a different price setting power if you are offering everything from one.
Yes, I think these companies, they want to have high quality because every, for example, installation which produces something, if they have a downtime, then it's very costly.
Of course. Energy
production, wind turbines, and all, if they're down, it's extremely costly. So if you have a partner which will bring this up extremely fast, then I think you're willing to pay a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Before, you also talked about corporates, that it's actually not that big of a competition for startups because the startups are really mission driven. Nevertheless, I think you've also mentioned that it's important that startups and corporates actually work closely together because they eventually can become customers of the startups or maybe even investors at some point. How should that collaboration happen and what do we need more of in Switzerland?
Yes, absolutely. I think startups very often with the ETH startup, it's a B2B business. And very often it's another corporate being the customer. And there is in some situations, there is also even investment or even a fusion or whatever in M&A process, which is in some direction very, very helpful because it will strengthen the existing company by new technology. I think it's important that big corporates are willing to take risks. I'm convinced, and we had even in my lab once a PhD about this, that for a big corporate, for making big steps in a new technology, it's cheaper and more successful if you do this with a startup. Yep. Because then you have more or less the wild people which are decoupled from the daily business, which are thinking quite differently. And once it's mature to integrate it to product, you can probably have a very strong collaboration or even buy the company or integrate it.
I'm not surprised. I think often the corporates, if they try to build their own solution, it's turning into something that often doesn't work and costs way more money than just working with a startup who will fix that for you.
Now, there is, I think, a lot of issues. First of all, the issue is that technology is progressing extremely fast. So meaning that probably these companies, they have 20 years ago, they have looked, can we do autonomous driving for production lines? And they realize it doesn't work. But meanwhile, technology is ready. But they still have in their head, it doesn't work. Yeah. We tried it and they will not do it. But now there's the next generation, which comes with all the new technology and knowledge, and they will make it happen.
Yeah. It's also very much about trust in that sense, I assume, because if you tried it yourself or you worked with someone and that didn't work out, you lose a bit of trust in that field, I imagine. That takes time to rebuild.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is so many technology which you had to try 5 times with a difference of 20 years or 30 years until it works. Because there is not only your field which is progressing, but all the fields which are contributing to it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's part of the entrepreneurial, and I assume also part of the research process. You have to fail multiple times probably along the way until you really get there where something works. Now, looking ahead, I know you just mentioned that you will step down from teaching, but even be more involved with startup. What is next at ETH when it comes to startup spin-offs and startup collaborations?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we have already a very good setting. So, of course, I'm also involved in this deep tech nation, Switzerland, where the dream is really to have more funding available in Switzerland for scaling our startups. This is something very important. I will still try to bundle a bit all these activities. There are also probably too many awards. We have to be careful. Young entrepreneurs, they like the awards because it's shiny, they're on the stage. Yep. But I always tell them, one award is enough. And then all the next awards are your clients.
Exactly.
If they order something, this is an award. Yep. And so we should still a bit improve on this end.
I actually like that you talk about that because I always feel the awards, it takes so much time away from you to go through an application process or a vetting process. And that time for you as a founder is much often way better spent in either improving your product or talking to customers. That's it from my perspective.
Yeah. We have a couple of examples where of startup companies which won all the awards but failed.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the wrong focus. Winning awards doesn't pay the bills.
The juries of the award, they are probably less good than your customer in the field, because the jury has to look at all different technologies.
Of course.
They cannot be as good, but your customer will actually tell you if it's good or not, because they know what they want.
I love what you said. Customers, that's the real award that you should go for. And is there any specific trend or technology that you are betting on or especially excited about for the next 10 years to come?
It's probably turning it around. So the funny thing at the moment, there is a lot of hype with humanoid robots. Mm-hmm. And it's funny how much the valuation of these companies, which are only starting, is, especially in Silicon Valley. And it looks like that is nearly a battle between the big rich people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all them, they want to be involved. Of course, as an engineer, I have also the dream to have a robot which is as capable as humans, because we are wonderful. But I don't know if this is really a market at the end. And I think we should probably focus a little bit more on functional robots, meaning that these robots are designed for the functions they have to fulfill. And of course, if you want to have a robot which can fulfill all functions, that's probably a humanoid robot. Yeah. But I'm personally convinced that we are still pretty far away for having such a machine. But we are not so far away to have a machine which is dedicated for some specific functions.
Yeah. So it's a bit a hype there, probably maybe an overhype in that sense.
Yeah, it's an overhype. Of course, I think for our field, it's good in a way that it drives technology, it drives better motors and better sensors. Everything is. Yeah. It's even for research, it's good. Yeah. The only downtime I see a little bit that those startups which are more or less doing functional robots, which have a very clear view about the application and the customers, they have much more problem to get funding. And then they see always, I'm evaluated only at 40 million, and these others are at $500 million already, and they have no product, and we already have something. And that's a little bit disappointing, I think, for the young generation.
Yeah, that must also be frustrating, right? Because then you say, hey, we have way more proof and customers and everything, but we are valid at the friction of the hype topic at the moment. Yeah, that sucks a bit if you're a founder in these shoes, but you just have to keep going because time will catch up, hopefully, and fix that error.
Yes.
I also have a few rapid fire questions for you, Roland, to wrap up the conversation. The first one, what's harder to teach, robotics or entrepreneurship?
Entrepreneurship, probably.
What is one ETH spin-off that you wish you had started yourself?
It's probably not an ETH spin-off in Switzerland, for example, eco-robotics, which is in the field, which is hard for me. This is about environment and food production in a sustainable way, and I wanted always to make more in this field.
I love that. And autonomous systems in 10 years, more helpful or more dangerous? That's also a topic we always hear and read about.
Of course, I'm convinced that it's more helpful, but we need to, as a society, really also drive this to a way that is more helpful.
Yeah. And what is the favorite startup pitch that you have ever heard? No need to name names if you don't want to, but what's the favorite pitch that you have ever heard?
That's very difficult to say. There's a lot of pitches. I have seen pitches which are extremely visionary, which that get also very good, easy money, and others which are very sound. I personally prefer those who are probably much more on the ground and saying this and this and this step we are doing. Yeah. But there is so many different pitches, and it's wonderful how they do this, these young people.
I love that. What gets you up in the morning? What gets you out of bed? What is like the thing that still drives you after being involved with startups and research over all these years?
I think it's mainly the young people which are so eager to create something and being part of this creation of new elements which hopefully are for the goods of the society.
It also keeps you young, I think, right?
Yes, I think it at least it's wonderful to be with young people, and it keeps you probably somewhat young.
Absolutely. And if you had 1 hour to mentor a founder or a researcher, who would you pick? Could be any person in the world. dead or alive?
I would prefer to support a founder.
Yeah, I love that. Cool. Roland, thank you so much for everything that you do for the Swiss startup ecosystem. You're a real driving force, and it was a pleasure having you back on the show. Thank you for everything, and all the best for the future.
Great pleasure. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.